Hey guys, welcome back. So in this video we're going to discuss the row and the rows and the column and the columns functions. Okay, so let's start with the row and the column functions here on the left. So first of all, the row function, what it does is that you give it a cell and then it will tell you which row this cell is. Okay, so for example, you give it cell B3 and it will tell you, you know what, cell B3 is in row number 3, so it outputs a 3. Also, if you give it a range, it will give you the row number of the first cell in the range. So here I've given it cells D7 to D9. That's a range. It will output a 7, the row number of the first cell in the range. If you put it without any cells in it, so you just put equals row without inputting any cells in it, because the input for the row function is basically optional. So if you don't put it, it will still work. So how it will work if you leave it blank is that it will give you the row number for the cell that you've written the function in. So we've written this row function in cell H9. So this is why it's outputted the number 9. The column function will do the same, except that it will output the column number instead of the row number. So here we've given it cell C5. So it would output a 3 because this is the column number for cell C5. Cell C5 is in column C. Column C is the third column. And also here we've given it a range C6 to E6. It outputs a 3 because it will actually extract the column number for the first cell in the range, which is cell C6, which is in the third column, so it's outputted a 3. Here we've put it as a blank function without any inputs, so this is why it's outputted an 8, because column H is the 8th column, so it's outputted the column number for the cell that we've written the function in. So these are the row and the column functions. Okay, so let's now discuss the rows and the column functions. Okay, so the rows function, what it will do is that you would give it a range and then it will tell you how many rows are in that range. So here we've given it range B2 till B7. Okay, so these are the cells, B2 till B7. So it will tell you, you know what, cells B2 to B7 contain 6 rows. Okay, this range contains 6 rows, so it's outputted the number 6. Okay, and if you give it a single cell, it will output just 1 because a single cell will only contain 1 row. So actually it will give you the number of rows that are spanning in your range. Okay, and of course a single cell will just span through 1 row only. This is why it outputs the number 1. And let me note as well that you cannot write this function blank, so you cannot not input a cell or a range in that rows function. You will get an error if you do not input a cell or a range. Okay, so the input in the rows function is mandatory. The columns function does the same thing as the rows function, except that it counts the columns, not the rows. Okay, so the columns function will give you the number of columns that are within a range or a single cell, but if in case if it's a single cell, then it will give you a 1, of course. Okay, so here I've given it cells B2 till D2, as you can see here. So it will tell me, you know what, cells B2 till D2, they contain 3 columns, so it's outputted the number 3. And if you give it a single cell, of course, it will output the number 1. Okay, so why would we bother with these functions? Like, why are we learning them? Well, the reason for that is that they are really powerful for incrementing numbers. So for like writing 1, 2, 3, if you want to write 1, 2, 3 in a really quick way, you can do that. So let me illustrate that with an example. So let's say I write equals rows, and then I would select just a single row. Let's say I'm going to select row 6 to 6. Okay, so that's the range. It's just a single row. And I'm actually going to absolute just the first part and leave the second part not fixed or relative. Okay, so here if I press enter, what's going to happen is going to output the number 1, because this range contains just a single row. So rows 6 to 6 will only contain just a single row. However, if I drag the formula down, this will actually become 2. The formula in the cell below it will output a 2. The reason for that is that because the second part of the range was not fixed or relative, this has resulted in the range expanding. And so the rows function is now detecting that we've got 2 rows within that range. And then if we keep on dragging the formula, you can see here that we're able to increment numbers. Okay, and this is the power of the rows function. And you can do the same with the columns function, except that you would drag to the right instead of downwards. Okay, because you'll be putting a range and you need to move columns, not rows. You need to expand columns, not rows. Okay, so why again would the rows function be useful? Well, it is useful because it can be used in conjunction with other functions, such as the HLOOKUP function, for example. So let's say I want to look up the value for the sales for cookies in January 14, February 14, and all the months actually. But I just need to write the formula once and then drag it down and get the values for sales for cookies in all the months. So how would I do that? Well, if I write equals HLOOKUP and then I look up cookies, and then the table array here is actually this table, and then the row index number, to be able to get the sales in January 14, I need to put a 2. However, I can actually put the rows function here, and then the range I'm going to give to the rows function, you can actually give it any range of cells containing 2 rows, but it's a better practice to actually start from the first row in your table here and get a range containing 2 rows from your table, and start actually from the first row in your table. And I'll tell you why it's a better practice just in a bit. Now, if you absolute the first part of that range and leave the second part relative, and then you close the brackets, and then here the range lookup is going to be an exact match, and we close the brackets as well, press enter, you can see here I got the sales for cookies in January 14. Here the range inside the rows function is between A1 to D2. So here this range contains 2 rows. You could have made it as well A1 to A2 only, as long as your range contains 2 rows. Okay? And if I drag the formula down, one step down, you can see here, because the second part was relative and not absolute, not fixed, it's become A1 to D3. Okay, and if you drag it one more step as well, it's become A1 to D4. Okay, so it's outputted here A4. And here it's outputted a 3, and here it's outputted a 2, as you can see here. So we've been able to get the sales for the different months by writing just the formula once and just dragging it down. And we could keep on dragging it down, but there is no space. But if we keep on dragging it down, we're going to get the sales for all the months here. And this is because we used the rows function as a number incrementer. Now, the part I told you about why it's a better practice to actually start the range in the rows function on your table here is because if someone inserts a row here, for example, the rows function is gonna cope with it. So here you can see here the range for getting the sales for cookies in January 14 has become A1 to D3. You know, the range inside the rows function, it was A1 to D2 previously. If I press Control and Z, it was A1 to D2. One step forward, it's become A1 to D3 when I inserted a new row. Okay? So if someone inserts a new row, someone makes any changes here to the structure of your spreadsheet, the rows function will cope with it. Okay? And you won't need to adjust the formula or anything. And this is why writing or using the rows function here in the row index number is better than using a constant. Okay, so if you use a constant here we needed 2 to get the sales for cookies in January 14. If we press enter, okay, this gives me the sales for cookies in January 14, but if someone inserts a row here, we get a 0. Whereas when we were using the rows function, someone inserts a row, we're still able to get the correct answer. Okay, I hope that you've understood that I've been able to get my point across. Okay, so the same idea goes with the columns function. Here we're going to use it with the VLOOKUP function. For example, let's say I want to get the sales for cookies and chocolate and ice cream for January 14. I just want to write the formula once and then drag it to the right, and then I'll get the values for sales for cookies and chocolate and ice cream in January 14. So my lookup value is going to be January 14, so I'm going to use the date function for that to generate the date for January 14. The date here is actually the 1st of January 2014. And then the table array is going to be this table. Okay, so I'm going to absolute it as well. The column index number, for that, I'm going to use the columns function. And you can use any range that is spanning across 2 columns, but it's a better practice to use a range in your table so that if someone inserts a new column in your table here between A and B, for example, the formula would react and adjust itself automatically. So here, if we use columns A1 to B1 and we make the second part relative, the second part of the range in the columns function, we make it relative, we only fix the first part, and then the range lookup is going to be an exact match. And we close our brackets, press enter. You can see here we got the sales for cookies in January 14. If we drag the formula to the right, we get the sales for chocolate in January 14. One more step, we got the sales for ice cream in January 14. So as you can see here, we're using the columns function to increment numbers as well. So as you can see here on the first formula, the columns function was counting the columns between A1 to B1. This is why it yielded a 2 and gave us the sales for cookies in January 14. And then on the second one here, the second part, because it was relative and not fixed, the range expanded and we got the sales for chocolate in January 14. And then the third part here, we got the sales for ice cream in January 14. And the same idea here goes when inserting a new column. If I insert a new column, the formula reacts and the results are correct still. But if I replace this with a constant, okay, so I put this as a 2 will give us the correct answer here as well. But if I insert a new column, you can see here we don't get the correct answer anymore. Okay, so it's a better practice in general to use the rows function and the columns function when writing a VLOOKUP or an HLOOKUP. And this is actually what I do all the time. You know, I have stopped using these constants here. I've stopped writing just a 2 or a 3 or a 4. I always use the columns function or the rows function for that reason. Okay? So I hope I've been able to get my point across. Okay? And actually the rows and the columns functions are very powerful for that reason. You can use them to increment numbers. I don't only use them with VLOOKUP and HLOOKUP. I use them with other functions as well, offset and other functions. You know, anytime I want to increment numbers, I just use the rows or the columns functions. They are really powerful, really awesome functions. Okay, so thank you guys for watching this video, and I'll see you on the next one.